My name is Chloe Vance. I'm 31 years old, a senior loan underwriter for a commercial bank, and I know a bad investment when I see one. But my mother-in-law Susan and my brother-in-law Travis thought I was their personal bailout fund. They walked into my kitchen 2 days before Thanksgiving and demanded I co-sign a $60,000 loan for a business that didn't exist. When I said no, they promised I'd regret it. They thought I'd cave to family pressure. They didn't realize they were forcing my hand. Before I tell you exactly what happened at that Thanksgiving dinner, take a moment to like and subscribe if you enjoy stories about setting boundaries. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I always love hearing from you. Now let's go back to that rainy Tuesday night. It was 9:20 p.m., pouring rain. My husband David and I were finishing dinner when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, Susan and Travis were standing there dripping wet, looking urgent. "We need to talk," Susan said, pushing past me into the house. Travis followed, carrying a thick manila folder. He looked nervous, shifting his weight from foot to foot. David came out of the kitchen looking as confused as I was. "Mom, Travis, what's going on?" David asked. Susan didn't waste time on pleasantries. She marched straight to our kitchen island, slapped the manila folder down, and looked at me. "Travis needs your help, Chloe, and we don't have much time." Travis opened the folder. Inside was a stack of loan applications, business plans, and financial projections. "I'm starting a boutique logistics firm." He said, his voice a little too loud, too rehearsed. "I found the perfect warehouse space, but the lease is competitive. I need $60,000 to secure it and get the first fleet of vans." I looked at the paperwork, then at Travis. "Okay," I said slowly. "Why are you showing this to me?" Susan sighed that dramatic, heavy sigh she saved for when she thought someone was being deliberately difficult. "Because the bank won't approve him, Chloe. You know how his credit is, but your credit is perfect. 820, right? The loan officer said if you co-sign, he can get the money by Friday." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Co-sign. They wanted me to attach my name, my financial future, my pristine credit score to Travis. Travis, who hadn't held a steady job in 5 years. Travis, who still owed David and me $10,000 from a surefire crypto investment 3 years ago. "You have 48 hours to sign." Susan continued, oblivious to my silence. "If we don't have the money by Thursday morning, he loses the warehouse. We assumed family would just say yes. We need this, Chloe. I am a senior loan underwriter. I spend 50 hours a week analyzing risk, verifying assets, and protecting my bank from bad loans. I didn't even need to read the full business plan to spot the red flags. The projections were vague, relying on contracts that hadn't been secured. The equipment costs were inflated. The consulting fees listed in the budget were suspiciously high. It was a disaster waiting to happen. "I can't do that, Susan," I said firmly. "What do you mean you can't?" Travis snapped, dropping his polite facade. "It's just a signature. I'll make all the payments. You won't even notice it." "If you default, the bank comes after me," I explained, trying to keep my voice level. "I'm legally responsible for that $60,000. And based on this paperwork, this isn't a solid business plan. I'm sorry, but I won't risk my credit for this." Susan's face hardened. Her eyes narrowed, and she leaned across the island. "We are family, Chloe. You have the means to help your brother-in-law achieve his dream, and you're refusing. We expected better from you." David stepped forward, trying to play peacemaker. "Mom, $60,000 is a lot of money. Chloe's just being careful. Maybe we can look over the plan and—" "There's nothing to look over," Susan interrupted, her voice rising. "She has the credit. Travis needs the money. That's all there is to it. We assumed you'd be supportive, Chloe, but I guess we were wrong." I looked her straight in the eye. "My name is not a backup plan, Susan, and my credit score is not a family asset." The silence in the kitchen was thick and heavy. Travis glared at me, his hands balled into fists. Susan snatched the folder off the island, her face flushed with anger. "Fine," Susan said, her voice cold and sharp. "If you won't help your family when they need you most, then you'll have to explain why to everyone else. See you at Thanksgiving dinner." She turned and marched out the front door, Travis trailing behind her. The door slammed, leaving David and me standing in the quiet kitchen. The rain lashed against the windows, a steady, relentless sound. "Chloe," David started, his voice strained. Maybe we should just… No, David. I cut him off. I am not co-signing that loan. And if your mother thinks she can bully me into it, she's wrong. But as I stood there watching the taillights of Susan's car fade into the rain, I knew this wasn't over. The real fight hadn't even started. Thanksgiving was in 2 days, and Susan had just promised me a war. Do you feel the tension building? What do you think Susan will do at Thanksgiving? I pulled the thick manila folder toward me, across the granite countertop, and opened it. As a senior loan underwriter, I spend 50 hours a week analyzing risk, verifying assets, and protecting my institution from financial disasters. I know exactly what a legitimate commercial loan application looks like. The paperwork sitting in front of me was a complete joke. It was a masterclass in financial smoke and mirrors. I scanned the first few pages of the business plan for Travis's supposed boutique logistics firm. It was entirely vague, filled with buzzwords, but devoid of any actual substance. There were no concrete market analyses. There were no secured vendor contracts. Most glaringly, there were absolutely no projected cash flows. Instead, the proposed budget was padded with ridiculous and inflated expenses. A massive allocation for consulting fees immediately caught my eye. You do not need $20,000 in unspecified consulting fees to lease a suburban warehouse and rent a few delivery vans. The math simply did not add up. I could feel Travis watching me. He was sweating slightly, shifting his weight from foot to foot, his eyes darting nervously between my face and the documents. He knew it was a scam, or at the very least, he knew the numbers were complete garbage. I turned to the loan application itself. The interest rate they were offering him was predatory, the terms were suffocating, and the bank had clearly flagged his social security number as a massive liability. Now Susan and Travis wanted me to step in and offer my pristine 820 credit score as a human shield. I closed the folder, aligned the edges perfectly, and pushed it back across the counter. I took a slow, deep breath, choosing my words with absolute precision. I cannot co-sign this loan, Travis. The silence in the kitchen shattered. Susan stepped forward, her polite and desperate facade instantly vanishing. The sweet mother-in-law routine evaporated, replaced by a cold and calculating glare. She looked at me as if I had just slapped her son across the face. "What do you mean you cannot do it?" she demanded. Her voice had dropped to a harsh, accusing register. I looked directly at her, refusing to break eye contact. "I mean exactly that. I will not attach my name, my social security number, or my financial future to this application. This business plan is completely hollow. There is no clear revenue stream to cover the monthly payments, and these massive consulting fees look highly suspicious. If Travis defaults, the bank will not care about his boutique logistics dreams. They will immediately come after me for the full $60,000. I am not putting my credit and my home at risk for a business that exists only on a few poorly typed pages." Travis slammed his hand down on the island, rattling the fruit bowl. "I am not going to default, Chloe. Why do you always have to be so arrogant and negative? You have the perfect credit score. The loan officer practically guaranteed the funds would drop by Friday if you just sign the bottom line. It is just a signature. You will not even have to do anything. It is a legal guarantee for $60,000, I fired back. My voice remained steady, though my heart was pounding hard against my ribs. I work in commercial banking, Travis. Every single day I see people lose their homes, their savings, and their marriages because they co-signed bad loans for relatives who made empty promises. I am not doing it. I will not become a cautionary tale for this family." David finally stepped in, raising his hands in a desperate attempt to mediate the exploding tension. He looked exhausted, caught between the wife he loved and the family he had been trained to pacify. "Mom, Travis, let us all just calm down. Chloe is a professional underwriter. If she says the numbers look bad, then they look bad. Maybe we need to revise the business plan before we rush into anything. We can look for other funding options or start smaller." Susan whipped her head around to glare at her oldest son. "There are no other funding options, David. We have 48 hours before he loses the warehouse lease to another buyer." She turned her fierce, unblinking gaze back to me. Her face was flushed with a rigid, self-righteous anger. "We assumed family would just say yes. We assumed you would want to support your brother-in-law's future instead of interrogating him like a criminal. Family supports each other, Chloe. When you married my son, I thought you understood that. But clearly you only care about yourself and your bank accounts. I stood my ground, refusing to let her toxic guilt trip manipulate me into financial ruin. My financial stability is not a backup fund for bad decisions, Susan. If you believe in this logistics business so deeply, you and Robert can easily co-sign the loan yourselves. I knew exactly why she had not. Susan and Robert lived in a massive, immaculate house across town. They drove luxury cars and boasted about their country club memberships. Yet here they were standing in my kitchen, aggressively begging the daughter-in-law they barely tolerated to take on massive debt. Something darker was hiding beneath this desperate demand, but I did not have the full picture yet. Susan snatched the manila folder off the counter, clutching it tightly against her chest. "Fine," she spat out, her voice dripping with venom. "If you want to be completely selfish, you can live with the consequences of that choice. But do not expect us to smile and pretend everything is normal. We will see you at Thanksgiving dinner on Thursday. And you can stand up and explain to the entire extended family why you decided to crush your brother-in-law's dreams just to protect your precious credit score. I am sure your aunts and uncles will be fascinated to hear how highly you value family." She did not wait for a response. Susan turned on her heel and marched out the front door, her heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway. Travis shot me one final glare full of pure resentment before rushing out after her. The heavy front door slammed shut behind them, rattling the window panes in the kitchen. David slumped against the counter, burying his face in his hands. He let out a long, shaky breath, terrified of the impending holiday showdown. He hated conflict, and his mother had just guaranteed a massive one. But as I stood there in the quiet kitchen, listening to the rain outside, I realized my simple refusal was no longer just about rejecting a bad loan. Susan had just drawn a line in the sand. She had declared a public war, and Thanksgiving dinner was going to be the battlefield. I had 48 hours to prepare myself for the ambush. Thanksgiving Day, at Susan and Robert's sprawling, immaculately decorated suburban home, felt less like a holiday and more like walking onto a theater stage where I didn't know the lines. They lived in one of those pristine, gated communities where the lawns were manicured to an unnatural perfection and the driveways were always filled with luxury SUVs. Inside the house smelled of expensive cinnamon candles and roasted turkey, a scent that usually meant comfort, but here, it just smelled like obligation. I was in the kitchen, carefully arranging cranberry sauce into a crystal bowl, trying to make myself as useful and invisible as possible. Over the past 5 years, David and I had become the unofficial financial shock absorbers for this family. We were the responsible ones, the ones who could always be counted on to quietly smooth over the rough edges of Susan's overspending or Travis's endless string of bad luck. 3 years ago, right after David and I got married, Travis had begged us for $10,000 to cover a temporary cash flow issue with some crypto startup he was heavily invested in. He swore he'd pay it back in 3 months. That was 36 months ago. We never saw a dime of it, and whenever I gently brought it up, Susan would sigh heavily and say, "Oh, Chloe, don't hold grudges over money. Family is more important than a few dollars." A few dollars. $10,000 was our entire emergency fund at the time, but in this house, bringing it up was considered a character flaw. "Could you pass the gravy boat, dear?" Susan's voice pulled me back to the present. She was wearing a tailored cashmere sweater, adjusting a massive floral arrangement on the dining room table. "And try not to spill it on the linen this year. I just had it professionally cleaned." "Of course," I said, handing it to her, my voice perfectly level. The house was packed. Aunts, uncles, and cousins. I only saw twice a year, milled about the living room holding wine glasses and laughing loudly at Robert's jokes. They were entirely unaware of the storm that had been brewing since Tuesday night. To them, we were just the happy, successful Carter family. Travis was holding court by the fireplace, nursing a bourbon, and talking animatedly to Uncle Richard about the disruptive potential of his new boutique logistics firm. He caught my eye across the room, and his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. There was a smugness there, a strange, misplaced confidence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. David was doing his best to run interference offering, to carve the turkey and refill drinks, anything to keep moving, anything to avoid sitting still in the heavy, toxic atmosphere. He looked exhausted, the dark circles under his eyes, a testament to the sleepless nights we'd had since Susan's 48-hour ultimatum. "Everything looks wonderful, Mom," David said, setting the carved turkey in the center of the massive oak table. "Well, I try." Susan sighed, taking her seat at the head of the table opposite Robert. "It's not easy pulling all this together, especially when you have so much weighing on your mind." She didn't look at me when she said it, but I felt the weight of her words settle over the room. The casual conversation began to die down as everyone took their seats. The clinking of silverware against fine china seemed unnaturally loud. I took my seat next to David, gripping my linen napkin under the table until my knuckles turned white. I could feel the trap closing the careful, deliberate setup that Susan had orchestrated. The extended family, the captive audience, the perfectly timed sighs of exhaustion. She had brought me here to perform an execution, and I was the one on the block. Before Robert even finished carving the turkey, Susan tapped her crystal wineglass with a silver fork. The sharp, clear chime sliced through the low hum of conversation, bringing the room to an immediate standstill. I watched her stand at the head of the table, smoothing the front of her cashmere sweater, her face shifting instantly from the gracious host to the wounded matriarch. 30 pairs of eyes turned toward her, expecting a standard toast about gratitude and family blessings. "I want to thank you all for coming." Susan began, her voice trembling, just enough to sound authentic. "Thanksgiving is usually a time of joy, but this year I have to be honest. It is heartbreaking when you realize that the family you have nurtured and loved has turned their back on you." My stomach plummeted. I shot a look at David, but he was staring at his plate, his jaw tight. "We are a family that supports one another." She continued, looking around the room, making deliberate eye contact with aunts and uncles, who were now leaning in, completely captivated. When Travis finally found his passion, a real tangible business opportunity that could secure his future, Robert and I were thrilled. We did everything we could, but we needed a little help, just a signature. She finally let her gaze fall on me, cold and accusing. We assumed that Chloe, who has been so blessed with a successful career, would want to lift her brother-in-law up. Instead, she coldly refused. She looked at his dreams and decided her credit score was more important than our family's future. She told us she would not risk a single penny for us. A collective gasp rippled through the dining room. The silence that followed was suffocating. I could feel the physical weight of 30 people turning against me simultaneously. "I just don't understand," Susan said, pulling a tissue from her sleeve and dabbing at her dry eyes. "We welcomed her into this family. We treated her like our own daughter. And this is how she repays us, by actively destroying Travis's one chance at success, because she is too greedy to share her pristine financial standing." The whispers started immediately. Aunt Carol shook her head, glaring at me. Cousin Mark muttered something to his wife that sounded like selfish. They didn't know about the fabricated business plan. They didn't know about the exorbitant consulting fees or the complete lack of cash flow. They only knew what Susan was feeding them, a carefully constructed narrative where I was the heartless villain hoarding my wealth while poor Travis suffered. I looked at David desperately, waiting for him to speak up. I waited for him to explain the financial reality, to defend his wife against this public execution. But David just sat there, frozen, shrinking into his chair as the judgmental glares intensified. He was paralyzed by his mother's performance. I didn't cry. The tears of frustration and betrayal burned behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall in front of these people. I took a slow, deliberate breath, the kind of breath I take before rejecting a high-risk commercial loan. I stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor, cutting off Susan's fake sobs. I picked up my pristine linen napkin, folded it meticulously, and dropped it onto my untouched plate of turkey and cranberry sauce. "I hope you all enjoy your dinner," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the chaos exploding inside me. I didn't look at Susan or Travis, and I didn't look back at my husband. I turned and walked toward the front door, my heels clicking against the floorboards, leaving David to choose whether he was going to follow his wife or stay seated at his mother's table. The immediate aftermath of Thanksgiving dinner was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. I barely had time to throw my coat on and start the car before my phone began vibrating against the console. It was David calling from inside his parents' house. I ignored it. I ignored the second call and the third. I needed the quiet of the car, the rhythmic swipe of the windshield wipers, to process the sheer audacity of what had just happened. When I finally pulled into our driveway, David was already there, pacing on the front porch. He had taken an Uber. He looked frantic. His tie loosened, his hair ruffled from the wind. He didn't even wait for me to unlock the front door before he started. "Chloe, you can't just walk out like that," he said, following me into the kitchen. "You humiliated my mother in front of the entire family." I dropped my keys on the counter. The metallic clatter sounded unnaturally loud. "I humiliated her, David. She stood up and told 30 people that I was actively trying to destroy your brother's life because I'm greedy. She orchestrated a public execution." "She's just stressed." He ran a hand over his face. "Travis is desperate. He's got this one chance to make something of himself, and he's going to lose it if he doesn't get that warehouse lease. Mom is just trying to protect him." "And who is protecting me?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. "Who is protecting us, David? Because from where I was sitting, it looked like you were perfectly fine letting her use my financial stability as a shield for Travis's bad decisions." David slumped against the kitchen island, the fight draining out of him. He looked exhausted, caught in the undertow of his family's toxic dynamics. "I'm not fine with it," he said softly. "But Chloe, if we don't do this, the fallout is going to be massive. You saw how they were looking at you. They're going to ice us out. It's going to be a war." "It's already a war," I countered. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a pleading whisper. "Just co-sign it, Chloe. Please, it's just a signature. I'll personally make the payments if Travis defaults. I promise. I'll take a second job if I have to. Let's just do this to keep the peace." Keep the peace. Those 3 words were the cornerstone of the Vance family's entire existence. Keep the peace by ignoring the red flags. Keep the peace by absorbing the financial hits. Keep the peace by letting Susan and Travis trample over every reasonable boundary. "I am not a financial meat shield," I said, looking him dead in the eye, "and I am not going to jeopardize our future to bail out a grown man who hasn't held a steady job in 5 years. If I sign that paperwork, I am legally responsible for $60,000. Your promises don't mean anything to the bank when the loan goes into default." The argument peaked right there in the kitchen. David accused me of being rigid, of prioritizing my credit score over his family. I accused him of being a coward, of letting his mother manipulate him into sacrificing his own wife. The rift between us tore open deep and ugly. He grabbed his keys and left, saying he needed space, driving off into the rain and leaving me alone in the silent house. I stood there in the quiet kitchen, the adrenaline fading, leaving behind a cold, sharp realization. I couldn't just say no. Saying no made me the villain. Saying no gave Susan the power to control the narrative, to paint me as the selfish daughter-in-law who refused to help. If I wanted to save my marriage, if I wanted to pull David out of the fog of guilt his family had kept him in for years, I had to prove to him that this wasn't just a bad loan. I had to prove it was a trap. The sound of David's car pulling out of the driveway faded into the relentless drumming of the rain. I stood alone in the center of my kitchen, the silence of the house pressing down on me. The metallic clatter of my keys on the counter still echoed in my mind, along with the desperate pleading tone of my husband's voice. He wanted me to sign the papers. He wanted me to absorb the risk, to swallow my professional judgment, and to become the financial shock absorber for his family's dysfunction. My tears of frustration had dried up, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. I walked back over to the kitchen island. The thick manila folder Travis had dropped there 2 days ago was still sitting exactly where Susan had left it. I reached out and placed my hand flat on the cool cardboard cover. For the past 48 hours, I had looked at this folder as a family problem. I had viewed it through the lens of a daughter-in-law dealing with an overbearing mother-in-law and a reckless brother-in-law. That was my mistake. I am a senior commercial loan underwriter. I evaluate risk for a living. I dismantle complex financial illusions every single day from 9 to 5. It was time. I stopped treating Travis like family and started treating him like a fraudulent applicant sitting across from my desk. I grabbed the folder, walked into my home office, and locked the door. I turned on the desk lamp, casting a sharp circle of light over my mahogany workspace. I booted up my laptop, the screen illuminating the dark room with a pale clinical glow. I opened the folder and spread the documents out across my desk. The business plan, the projected cash flows, the equipment invoices, and the commercial lease agreement. Taken together, it looked like an impressive stack of initiative. But I knew scammers always rely on volume to hide the lack of substance. I started with the most basic foundational element of any commercial loan, the legal entity. Travis had listed his business as Apex Logistics, LLC. I opened a new browser tab and navigated directly to the Pennsylvania Department of State Public Business Registry. This public database lists every legally registered business entity operating within the state. I typed Apex Logistics, LLC into the search bar. I hit enter. The screen loaded for a fraction of a second before displaying a single line of text. No records found. I paused. Sometimes people misspell their own company names on applications. I searched just the word Apex. I searched by his registered agent name. I searched by his home address. I broadened the parameters to include the entire tri-state area. I spent 20 minutes running every possible variation of the company name and his personal details through the state database. Nothing. Apex Logistics, LLC did not exist. It had no tax identification number. It was a ghost. A chill ran down my arms. I pulled the commercial warehouse lease agreement toward me. It was printed on heavy bond paper, complete with a professional-looking letterhead from a prominent regional commercial real estate broker. It detailed a 5-year lease for a 12,000-square-foot warehouse on the industrial side of the city. It even had a forged signature from a supposed leasing agent at the bottom. I logged into a commercial property database that I use daily at the bank. I typed in the exact address of the warehouse listed on Travis's lease. The property profile popped up immediately. The warehouse was real, but it was currently occupied by a massive corporate plumbing supply distributor. According to the county records, that plumbing company had just signed a 10-year lease extension 3 months ago. The building was not vacant. It was not on the market. The lease agreement sitting on my desk was a complete and utter fabrication. Travis had downloaded a template from the internet, slapped a real address on it, and forged a broker's signature. My heart started pounding a heavy rhythmic thud against my ribs. I moved to the equipment invoices and the massive consulting fees. I ran the names of the vendors through standard search engines. The company he claimed was selling him a fleet of used delivery vans was actually a residential landscaping business in Ohio that had permanently closed 2 years ago. The logistics consulting firm he was supposed to pay $20,000 to did not have a website, a phone number, or a physical address. I sat back in my desk chair, the leather creaking in the quiet room. I stared at the spread of documents illuminated by the desk lamp. The implications crashed over me like freezing water. This was not a bad business plan. This was not a naive young man trying to start a company with overly optimistic numbers. This was a calculated, deliberate financial crime. There was no boutique logistics firm. There was no warehouse lease to secure by Thursday morning. There were no delivery vans. Every single piece of paper Travis had brought into my kitchen was a prop in a meticulously designed theatrical performance meant to separate me from my money. If I had caved to Susan's public shaming at Thanksgiving, if I had listened to David's desperate pleading and signed my name on that bottom line, the bank would have deposited $60,000 into an account controlled by Travis. He would have drained those funds immediately. There would be no business revenue to make the monthly payments. The loan would have defaulted almost instantly. My pristine credit score, the financial foundation I had spent a decade building, would have been completely destroyed. The bank would have garnished my wages and come after the equity in the home David and I shared. Susan knew this. She had stood in my kitchen and looked me dead in the eye, demanding I hand over my financial security for a phantom company. She had stood in front of 30 extended family members and cried fake tears, calling me a heartless villain for destroying her son's dreams. She knew there were no dreams. She knew it was a scam, and she was entirely willing to sacrifice my life to make it happen. I gathered the fake documents and placed them back into the manila folder, my hands moving with cold, robotic precision. The anger inside me was no longer a hot, chaotic flame. It had condensed into something hard, dense, and razor-sharp. I now had definitive proof that the business was a lie. But solving that puzzle only unlocked a much darker, far more terrifying question. If there was no logistics company, why did Travis need exactly $60,000 in untraceable cash by the end of the week? What kind of massive hidden disaster was my husband's family desperately trying to cover up? I was going to find out, and I was going to tear their entire facade down to the studs. I didn't sleep that night. Instead of tossing and turning, I sat at my home office desk, the fake loan documents spread out like a morbid puzzle. I had dismantled the illusion of the boutique logistics firm, but the $60,000 question remained. Why did Travis need exactly that amount, and why was the deadline so frantic? My professional instincts, honed over years of analyzing financial risk, told me to follow the money, or in this case, the lack of it. People do not fabricate an entire commercial lease agreement and fake vendor invoices just for fun. They do it out of sheer desperation. I needed to know exactly what kind of desperation was driving my husband's family. I started by checking the state's public court records database. It's an open portal, fully accessible if you know how to navigate the archaic search functions. Most people assume court records are hidden, but civil dockets are largely public information. I typed in Travis's full legal name and narrowed the search parameters to our county and the 2 surrounding ones. I expected to find a few unpaid parking tickets, or maybe a minor collections dispute from his endless string of failed jobs. What the database returned was an active, high-priority civil litigation case, filed 6 months ago. The plaintiff was a major regional auto insurance carrier. The defendant was Travis. My heart hammered against my ribs as I clicked on the docket summary. The details were meticulously logged, a stark contrast to his flimsy business plan. 8 months ago, Travis had run a red light in a suburban intersection. He T-boned a brand new luxury SUV driven by a software executive. Travis was driving his beat-up sedan. He was entirely at fault. But the devastating part, the detail that made my blood run cold, was the insurance status. Travis had let his auto insurance policy lapse 3 months prior to the accident. He was driving completely uninsured. The software executive had suffered whiplash and a fractured wrist requiring surgery and physical therapy. The luxury SUV was totaled. The executive's insurance company had covered their client's expenses, and now they were coming after Travis through subrogation to recoup their massive losses. I downloaded the latest court filing. It was a proposed settlement agreement. The insurance company had offered Travis a brutal choice pay, a lump sum of exactly $60,000 within 30 days to cover the medical costs and the totaled vehicle, or they would proceed to trial. If it went to trial, the judgment would easily exceed $100,000, forcing Travis into immediate bankruptcy. Furthermore, because he was driving uninsured and caused bodily injury, the plaintiff's attorneys were threatening to refer the case to the district attorney for criminal negligence charges if the settlement wasn't met. The deadline for the $60,000 payment was this coming Friday. The exact same day Susan had told me the warehouse lease would expire. I sat back in my chair, the glow of the monitor casting long shadows across my office. The sheer audacity of the lie was suffocating. There was no logistics company. There were no delivery vans. There were no consulting fees. The $60,000 wasn't an investment in Travis's future. It was a desperate bribe to keep him out of bankruptcy court and potentially out of jail. And Susan knew. She absolutely knew. I recalled her performance at my kitchen island. The urgency in her voice, the way she had leaned across the counter and told me Travis had finally found a real business opportunity. I thought about her tearful, calculated speech at Thanksgiving dinner, where she stood in front of 30 extended family members and painted me as a greedy, heartless monster who was crushing her son's entrepreneurial dreams. She had orchestrated a public execution of my character to cover up a felony. She had been perfectly willing to trick me into committing bank fraud, tying my pristine credit and my financial stability to a fake business loan just to bail her reckless son out of a massive legal disaster. The betrayal wasn't just deep, it was criminal. They hadn't just asked for a favor, they had constructed an elaborate financial trap designed to ruin me. I printed the entire 40-page court docket, highlighting the settlement amount and the Friday deadline. I placed it in a red folder, separate from the fake business documents. I needed David to see this. I needed my husband to look at the cold, hard legal facts and understand exactly what his mother and brother were trying to do to us. When David finally walked through the front door just after sunrise, he looked exhausted, the weight of the family argument still hanging on his shoulders. He slumped onto the couch, running a hand over his face. I walked into the living room, holding the red folder. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. The anger had burned away, leaving a chilling, absolute clarity. I found out what the $60,000 is really for. I said, my voice steady in the quiet house. I dropped the folder onto the coffee table right in front of him. Travis isn't starting a business, David. He's trying to pay off a massive civil lawsuit before he gets indicted. David looked up from the living room couch when I walked in. He looked entirely drained, rubbing his temples as if trying to massage away the massive rift between us since Thanksgiving. He expected me to yell. He expected another bitter argument about family loyalty and my refusal to help his brother. Instead, I walked over to the coffee table and dropped the heavy red folder right in front of him. The slap of cardboard against wood echoed in the quiet house. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. The burning anger inside me had frozen into something harder and more dangerous. I told him to open it. David stared at the red folder for a long moment before reaching out. His hands were hesitant. When he flipped open the cover, he expected to see the fake business plan or the forged commercial lease agreement Travis had brought to our kitchen. What he saw instead was a certified civil court docket. I watched his eyes scan the dense legal text. I watched his brow furrow in confusion as he read the names of the plaintiff and the defendant. It took him a few seconds to understand that he was looking at a massive lawsuit against his own brother. I did not wait for him to ask questions. I laid out the cold facts exactly as I would present a risk assessment to a bank executive. I told David that Travis was not starting a boutique logistics firm. There was no warehouse. There were no delivery vans. 8 months ago, Travis caused a severe traffic accident while driving completely uninsured. He totaled a brand new luxury vehicle and caused significant physical injuries to the other driver. The insurance company was suing him for damages. The proposed settlement agreement to keep Travis out of civil court demanded a lump sum payment. David flipped to the second page of the document, his hands beginning to shake. I watched his eyes land on the settlement figure and the payment deadline. $60,000. Due this coming Friday. The exact same amount and the exact same deadline his mother had given me to secure the fake warehouse lease. The color drained entirely from my husband's face. He dropped the paperwork back onto the coffee table like it had physically burned him. He leaned forward, burying his face in his hands, letting out a sound that was half gasp and half sob. It was the sound of a man watching his entire reality shatter into a million jagged pieces. For 33 years, David had believed his family was simply close-knit and protective. I had always defended his mother's overbearing nature and his brother's endless mistakes. Now, the absolute truth was staring him right in the face. I stood over him and made him face the reality of what they had tried to do. I reminded him of how his mother had stood in our kitchen, aggressively demanding that I hand over my pristine credit score for a fake business. I reminded him of Thanksgiving dinner. Susan had stood at the head of a table surrounded by 30 extended family members and delivered a tearful, calculated speech. She had publicly executed my character, calling me a greedy and heartless villain who was destroying her son's entrepreneurial dreams. She did all of it to cover up a massive hidden felony. David looked up at me, his eyes red and filled with devastated realization. He finally understood the trap. If he had convinced me to co-sign that loan to keep the peace, the bank would have deposited $60,000 into an account controlled by Travis. That money would have gone straight to the insurance company settlement. There would be no business revenue to make the monthly loan payments. The loan would have defaulted immediately. The bank would have destroyed my credit, garnished my wages, and come after the equity in our home. Susan and Travis had constructed an elaborate financial trap designed to completely ruin my entire life. David reached out and took my hand. He apologized over and over again, his voice breaking. He told me he was so sorry for doubting me, sorry for pushing me to sign sorry. His own mother and brother were capable of such calculated malice. He promised we were done with them, that he would cut them off entirely for trying to destroy his wife. The ultimate betrayal was absolute, but I did not pull him into a forgiving embrace just yet. I squeezed his hand and told him that while the discovery of the lawsuit proved they were lying, it did not actually solve the entire puzzle. In fact, it opened up a much darker and more sinister question. I asked David to stop reacting like a betrayed son and start thinking logically for a single minute. I needed him to look at the larger financial picture of the family. I reminded him about the life his parents lived. Susan and Robert lived in a sprawling, immaculately decorated suburban estate, valued at roughly $900,000. They drove luxury vehicles. They took expensive vacations. Susan constantly bragged about their exclusive country club memberships and Robert's incredibly healthy retirement accounts. They projected an image of absolute wealth and unshakable financial stability to their entire social circle. I looked David dead in the eye and presented the ultimate contradiction. If your son is facing immediate bankruptcy and potential jail time for an uninsured accident, and you have significant accumulated wealth, you simply write a check. You dip into your savings, or you liquidate an asset, or you take out a small equity loan against your $900,000 estate. You handle the problem internally. You do not stage an elaborate, highly illegal financial fraud to trick your daughter-in-law into taking out a high-interest commercial loan. Unless you absolutely have to. David stared at me, the confusion returning to his exhausted face. He asked me what I was implying. I told him I was not implying anything. I was simply following the money. People with deep pockets do not resort to desperate, convoluted fraud to secure $60,000. The only reason Susan and Robert would force me to be their financial meat shield was if they did not have the money themselves. The fake business and the Thanksgiving manipulation were acts of total desperation. I was going to find out exactly what kind of financial disaster my wealthy in-laws were desperately trying to hide behind their country club facade. I didn't stop at the court documents. The civil lawsuit explained Travis's desperate need for $60,000 by Friday, but it didn't explain the rest of the family's bizarre behavior. It didn't explain why Susan and Robert, who constantly paraded their wealth and country club status, hadn't simply written a check to save their oldest son from financial ruin and potential criminal charges. I needed to see the complete financial picture of the people who had tried to destroy me. I sat back down at my desk, the glow of the monitor illuminating the dark office. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I am a commercial loan underwriter. I know how to find the invisible threads that connect assets and liabilities. I opened a new browser window and navigated to the County Property Tax Assessor's public portal. It's a clunky, outdated system, but it holds the financial history of every piece of real estate in the county. I typed in the address of Susan and Robert's sprawling, $100,000 suburban estate. The screen loaded and the property profile appeared. I expected to see a standard 30-year fixed-rate mortgage, perhaps mostly paid off given their age and purported success. Instead, the page was a tangled mess of lien secondary loans and frantic financial maneuvering. I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes tracking the dates and amounts. 10 years ago, they had taken out their first home equity line of credit, or HELOC, for $150,000. 5 years later, they took out another one for $200,000. 2 years after that, they refinanced the entire property, stripping out almost every remaining dollar of equity they had built over the decades. I thought about the way Susan always talked about her life. I remembered her standing in her immaculate kitchen last Thanksgiving, wearing a cashmere sweater that cost more than my first car, bragging to her sister about their new membership at the exclusive Oak Ridge Country Club. I remembered Robert loudly discussing his aggressive retirement portfolio at family dinners, swirling an expensive glass of scotch. It was all a meticulously crafted performance. The luxury cars, the designer clothes, the lavish holiday parties. None of it was paid for with actual wealth. It was funded by treating their home like an endless ATM. But the Hellocks weren't the worst part. I scrolled down to the most recent filings, the ones recorded within the last 6 months. My breath caught in my throat. There, buried under the older loans, was a formal notice of default filed by their primary mortgage lender. Susan and Robert were entirely broke. They had exhausted every line of credit, drained their equity, and stopped making their mortgage payments entirely. The county records showed they were exactly 90 days delinquent. I sat in the silence of my home office, the magnitude of the lie washing over me. They were living in a $900,000 house that they no longer owned. The bank was preparing to take it back. And right in the middle of their own impending financial collapse, Travis had caused a catastrophic uninsured accident that demanded a $60,000 lump sum settlement. The trap made terrifying sense now. They couldn't bail Travis out because they didn't have a single dollar to their name. They couldn't take out another loan because their credit was destroyed by the impending foreclosure. They were drowning the water rising above their heads, and they had looked around for a life raft. They had looked at me. Susan hadn't just asked me for a favor. She had calculated my worth based on my pristine credit score and my stable income. She had orchestrated the fake business plan, the tearful Thanksgiving performance, and the public shaming, all designed to manipulate me into signing away my financial future. She was perfectly willing to let me take on a $60,000 debt, knowing full well it would default, just to buy her son a few more months of freedom while her own house burned down around her. I printed the property tax records, the HELOC histories, and the notice of default. The printer whirred loudly in the quiet room, spitting out page after page of undeniable proof. I added these documents to the red folder containing Travis's civil lawsuit. The anger I had felt earlier that night, the hot, chaotic feeling of betrayal, was gone. It had burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, sharp resolve. I had spent the last 5 years trying to be the perfect daughter-in-law. I had swallowed the passive-aggressive comments, ignored the blatant favoritism, and accepted their casual disrespect because I believed that family required sacrifice. But this wasn't family. This was a financial syndicate built on lies, and I was their designated victim. They thought they could use my diligence, my responsibility, and my desire for peace against me. They thought I would be an easy mark. They had severely underestimated exactly who they were dealing with. I picked up the heavy red folder. The trap they had set for me was entirely exposed, but the game wasn't over. I was going to make sure they faced the consequences of every single lie they had told. The payoff was staggering, but not in the way Susan and Robert had anticipated. I didn't yell. I didn't throw the documents in their faces. I simply laid the printed property tax records, the HELOC histories, and the notice of default on the table between us. I watched as the color drained from Robert's face, his eyes fixed on the undeniable proof of their financial ruin. Susan's mouth opened and closed, no words coming out as she stared at the papers that exposed the lie she had lived for a decade. "You're broke," I said, my voice eerily calm, cutting through the silence of the room. "You've been broke for years. You've stripped every dollar of equity out of this house to fund a lifestyle you couldn't afford, and now the bank is taking it back." I watched the realization hit them. The luxury cars, the country club memberships, the lavish parties, they were all built on a foundation of debt that had finally crumbled. They were 3 months behind on their mortgage in active pre-foreclosure, and they had absolutely no equity left. The $900,000 estate they paraded as proof of their success was nothing more than an illusion they could no longer maintain. "You didn't need me to cosign a loan for Travis's fake business." I continued leaning forward, ensuring every word landed with the weight of truth. "You needed me to be your financial lifeboat. You knew you were drowning, and you thought you could use my pristine credit to save yourselves. You orchestrated this entire charade, this fake business plan, the Thanksgiving performance, all of it just to trap me into taking on your debt." The silence in the room was deafening. The wealthy facade they had maintained for so long was entirely shattered. The tension skyrocketed not because of a screaming match, but because the truth was far more devastating than any argument could ever be. I realized then that the entire family was a financial house of cards, and they had been desperate enough to use me as their final desperate play. But they had made one fatal mistake. They had assumed I would simply say yes. They had assumed I would be the quiet, obedient daughter-in-law they could exploit. They had severely underestimated who they were dealing with, and now they were going to face the consequences of their actions. The morning after I discovered the pre-foreclosure notices and the civil lawsuit, I woke up ready for a war. I had the printed documents neatly arranged inside a red folder on my home office desk. I was fully prepared for Susan to march up my driveway and demand my signature for that $60,000 commercial loan. I had spent hours rehearsing exactly how I would lay out the evidence of her financial ruin and her son's impending criminal negligence charges. I was ready to watch her carefully constructed facade crumble right in my living room, but the doorbell never rang. My phone never buzzed with her passive-aggressive text messages. Monday drifted into Tuesday. Tuesday faded into Wednesday. A full week passed without a single word from my husband's family. To anyone else, this sudden lack of communication might have felt like a victory. David certainly took it that way. He walked around our house with his shoulders slightly lower, breathing a heavy sigh of relief. He genuinely believed that his mother had finally respected our boundaries and backed off. But I am a commercial loan underwriter. My entire career is built on detecting patterns of human behavior when money is on the line. I know exactly how desperate people act when their financial walls are caving in, when a person is staring down a massive settlement deadline to keep their son out of prison. They do not just politely walk away and respect your space. They escalate. They fight harder. The silence stretching across those 7 days was not the sound of surrender. It was the sound of a predator crouching in the tall grass, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Susan was not giving up. She was simply changing her strategy. I could feel the invisible tension pulling tighter and tighter with every hour that passed. I found myself checking the locks on the doors twice before bed. I flinched every time a car drove slowly past our front window. The quiet was suffocating, thick and heavy, with unspoken threats. Then came Thursday evening. David and I were in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner. The house was completely still, except for the running water in the sink. When his cell phone started vibrating against the granite countertop, the sudden noise made us both jump. I looked down and saw his mother's name flashing brightly across the screen. David looked at me, a familiar look of panic washing over his face. He reached out with a wet hand and accepted the call, pressing the speaker button so I could hear every word. I braced myself for the incoming wave of guilt trips, tears, and furious demands. I expected her to scream about the warehouse lease expiring tomorrow. Instead, a bright, cheerful voice floated out of the small speaker. "David, sweetheart, how are you doing?" Susan asked. Her tone was dripping with a sickly, sweet affection that I had not heard in years. It was the exact voice she used when she was trying to impress the wives at her country club. David stuttered, completely thrown off balance by her cheerful mood. He told her we were fine and cautiously asked what she wanted. "Oh, I just wanted to share some wonderful news." She continued, her voice practically singing. "You and Chloe do not need to worry about that little business loan anymore. Travis and your father were at a networking event yesterday, and they completely hit it off with an independent venture capitalist. This new investor absolutely loved the business plan. He wrote a check for the full $60,000 this morning to cover the warehouse lease and the delivery vans. We are just so thrilled for your brother. Everything is coming together perfectly. So you two just relax and have a wonderful weekend. Tell Chloe I send my love." She ended the call before David could even form a response. The kitchen fell back into a heavy, stunning silence. David let out a massive breath, a huge, genuine smile breaking across his exhausted face. He turned to me, looking like a man who had just been granted a last-minute pardon by the governor. "You see," he said, his voice light and full of hope, "they found another way. We do not have to fight about this anymore. It is over, Chloe." My mother was telling the truth about the business. We can finally just move on. He pulled me into a hug, burying his face in my shoulder, entirely desperate to believe that his family was normal and safe. I hugged him back, but my arms felt completely numb. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a cold dread pooling in the pit of my stomach. Everything inside me was screaming that we were in terrible danger. I looked over David's shoulder and stared blankly at the dark kitchen window. I knew the cold, hard math of their reality. There was no independent venture capitalist. Legitimate investors do not write massive checks to uninsured drivers facing civil lawsuits and criminal negligence charges. They do not fund phantom companies with fabricated lease agreements. They do not hand over cash to families sitting in active pre-foreclosure with completely maxed out equity lines. It was a massive, terrifying lie. Susan had orchestrated a public execution of my character at Thanksgiving, demanding my credit score to save them. Now she was acting like none of it ever mattered. The desperation had not vanished. The $60,000 settlement deadline was still tomorrow. If they no longer needed my voluntary signature to get the money, it meant only one thing. They had found a way to take it without asking. The trap had not disappeared. It had just snapped shut around us in the dark. I closed my eyes and held my husband tight. The battle was no longer about a simple family disagreement. We were now dealing with calculating criminals, and I was their target. It was 1:00 p.m. on a standard Wednesday. I was sitting in my cubicle at the bank, halfway through a complex risk assessment for a regional distributor. The office was humming with the usual midweek sounds, low conversations, the rhythmic clicking of keyboards, and the soft hum of the air conditioning. I had just taken a sip of lukewarm coffee when my phone buzzed against the desk. It wasn't a text message or an email. It was an urgent red alert ping from my credit monitoring service. I set my mug down slowly. A standard alert usually meant my monthly credit card statement had been processed or my score had slightly fluctuated. But this was different. This was a critical notification demanding immediate attention. I swiped the screen, my pulse quickening. The notification read, "A hard inquiry has been detected on your credit profile." A hard inquiry means someone has formally requested to borrow money using your identity. I hadn't applied for a credit card, a mortgage, or an auto loan. I hadn't applied for anything. I logged into the app, my fingers moving frantically over the screen. The details loaded and the air seemed to vanish from my lungs. An unsecured personal loan application had just been submitted to a major online lender. The amount requested was exactly $60,000. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. $60,000. The exact amount Travis needed to settle his lawsuit. The exact amount Susan had aggressively demanded I cosign. But I hadn't cosigned anything. I hadn't signed a single piece of paper. I refreshed the screen, hoping it was a glitch, an error, some massive technological mistake. It wasn't. The screen refreshed and the notification updated with terrifying speed. Application approved. Funds are currently processing for disbursement. They hadn't just applied. They had been approved. The color drained from my face. My hands began to shake so violently that I had to place my phone flat on the desk just to read the rest of the details. The loan had been opened under my full legal name, using my current address and tied directly to my pristine 820 credit score. But to get an instant approval for an unsecured loan of that size, they needed more than just my name and address. They needed the master key to my entire financial life. They needed my social security number. My mind raced, frantically searching for how they could have possibly gotten it. I am meticulous with my personal data. I shred every document. I freeze my credit when I'm not actively using it. I never leave sensitive paperwork lying around. But as I sat there, the blood roaring in my ears, a memory surfaced cold and sharp. 3 years ago, right after David and I got married, we were trying to buy our first house. We were compiling a massive mountain of financial documents for the mortgage underwriter. David had asked his parents to dig through their files for an old tax return he needed from before we were married a year, where we had filed jointly as a trial run to see the tax implications. We had given them a copy to hold on to because their fireproof safe was bigger than ours. I had completely forgotten about it. It was a single piece of paper buried in a box in Susan's immaculate home office, containing both of our social security numbers. Susan hadn't just saved that document. She had weaponized it. She had taken my social security number, my name, and my financial reputation, and she had fed them into an online lending portal. She had forged my digital signature answering security questions that David had likely provided her with over the years in casual conversation. She had done all of this knowing that if I discovered it, it would destroy our relationship forever. But she didn't care about our relationship. She cared about bailing out her favorite son, and she was willing to sacrifice me on the altar of her desperation. The sudden silence from my in-laws over the past week wasn't surrender. It wasn't a sudden realization of boundaries. It was the silence of a predator, quietly picking the lock to my financial future. Susan's sweet phone call to David, claiming they had found another investor, was a smokescreen. The investor was me. I was the one funding Travis's legal bailout, and they had simply stolen the money using my identity. I sat back in my office chair, the cubicle walls suddenly feeling like they were closing in on me. The family drama, the passive-aggressive comments, the Thanksgiving shaming, the fake business plan had instantly evaporated. This was no longer a toxic family dispute. It was no longer a disagreement over boundaries or a clash of personalities. Susan and Travis had just committed federal wire fraud and identity theft. They had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. They had escalated a family argument into a criminal offense that carried severe prison time. I stared at the approved notification glowing on my phone screen. They thought they had won. They thought they had outsmarted the system, secured the money, and saved Travis from his impending lawsuit. They assumed I would just absorb the debt, that I would be too scared of the family fallout to report my own mother-in-law to the police. They assumed I was just a quiet, obedient daughter-in-law who would eventually cave to their demands. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I am a senior commercial loan underwriter. I spend my life tracking fraudulent transactions and dismantling financial illusions. They hadn't just stolen my identity, they had handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy them completely. I picked up my phone. I didn't call David. I didn't call Susan to scream or demand answers. I called a seasoned financial fraud attorney I had worked with for years. The trap was about to spring, and this time I was the one holding the trigger. My first instinct was to dial 911. The adrenaline was surging so violently through my veins that my vision actually blurred for a second. I sat frozen in my cubicle, staring at the glowing screen of my phone. The notification from my credit monitoring service felt like a physical blow to the chest. Susan and Travis had stolen my identity. They had forged my signature. They were actively attempting to defraud a major online lender out of $60,000. The urge to hear police sirens pull up to their pristine $900,000 estate was nearly overwhelming. I wanted to watch Susan's carefully constructed country club facade crumble into dust as officers handcuffed her on her own front lawn in full view of the neighbors she was so desperate to impress. But I forced myself to stop. I pulled my shaking hand back from the phone and took a slow, deep breath, the exact kind of measured breath I take before rejecting a high-risk commercial loan at the bank. I am a senior underwriter. I spend my days dismantling complex financial illusions and analyzing risk. I know exactly how the legal system works, and I know how incredibly slippery financial fraud can be when it involves close family members. If I called the police right now, the loan was still pending. The funds had not been dispersed into an account Travis controlled. If authorities showed up at Susan's door today, she would immediately play the victim. I could already see her performance. She would cry fake, delicate tears and tell the officers it was just a massive misunderstanding. She would claim that David had given her verbal permission to use my information to help his brother, or she would say that I had agreed to it during the chaos of Thanksgiving and then suddenly gotten cold feet. She would spin a narrative of a confused mother just trying to keep her family afloat. The police might look at the situation, see a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law fighting, and write it off as a civil domestic dispute rather than a clear-cut case of federal wire fraud. Even worse, I had to consider my husband. If David hesitated for a single second when questioned by the police, if his lifelong ingrained habit of protecting his mother kicked in under pressure, the authorities might drop the investigation entirely. I could not risk acting prematurely and giving them a chance to slip away. I needed an ironclad case. I needed irrefutable documented proof that they knew exactly what they were doing and that they fully intended to steal the money. I locked my office door, pulled the blinds shut, and bypassed the local police department number on my phone. Instead, I scrolled down to my personal professional contacts. I dialed the direct private line of Richard Vance. Richard was a seasoned, ruthless financial fraud attorney I had worked with for several years, eight incredibly complex commercial fraud cases, and I trusted his legal judgment completely. Richard answered on the second ring. I did not waste time with polite pleasantries. I laid out the entire situation in cold, clinical detail. I told him about the fake logistics company, the forged commercial warehouse lease, the impending civil lawsuit settlement Travis was facing, and the active pre-foreclosure notice on my wealthy in-law's estate. Finally, I told him about the hard inquiry on my credit report and the approved $60,000 unsecured personal loan that was currently processing. Richard listened in absolute silence. When I finished speaking, he let out a long, low whistle. Chloe, this is not just a toxic family dynamic or poor boundaries anymore. Richard said, his voice deadly serious and completely stripped of any warmth. This is felony identity theft and federal wire fraud, but you are absolutely right not to call the police yet. If you blow the whistle before the money actually moves, it is merely an attempted crime. That is much harder to prosecute, especially with family involved. A defense attorney will claim you gave consent and just changed your mind, and reasonable doubt will destroy your case. So what do? I asked, gripping the phone so tightly, my knuckles turned stark white. The loan is approved. The funds are going to drop into an account I do not control. If I let this process, my pristine credit is ruined, and I am on the hook for their debt. We are going to build a trap, Richard replied smoothly, the tone of a hunter locking onto a target. You are not going to freeze the disbursement entirely. You are going to let them think they won. But you need to intercept the funds before Travis can touch a single penny, and you must get them to confess in writing. Richard outlined a meticulous, calculated strategy. He told me I needed to contact the internal fraud department of the online lender immediately, but I would not cancel the loan application. Instead, I would provide them with a preliminary identity theft warning and instruct them to divert the approved funds into a frozen holding account. Travis's online portal would show the money as deposited, giving them a false sense of victory. But any attempt to transfer or withdraw the cash would trigger a hard administrative block. Step 2 is the most critical part of this operation. Richard continued, his voice sharp and commanding. You need irrefutable documented proof of them acknowledging the forgery and the receipt of funds. You need to get Susan on the record, text messages or emails. You need something digital that proves she orchestrated this financial theft without your knowledge or consent. I felt a cold, heavy knot form in the pit of my stomach. You want me to talk to her after she stole my social security number and tried to ruin my life? I want you to play the victim, Richard said. I want you to call her and pretend you are finally ready to cave. Tell her the guilt from Thanksgiving is eating you alive. Tell her you want to come over and sign the original business loan paperwork to save the family. She will panic because she knows the forged personal loan is already processing, and she cannot let you see the original papers. If you push the exact right buttons, she will slip up and admit she handled the financing herself. It was a dangerous psychological game. If Susan suspected for a fraction of a second that I knew about the forged loan, she would immediately destroy the digital evidence, delete the accounts, and claim complete innocence. I had to play the exact role she had designed for me. I had to be the compliant, easily manipulated daughter-in-law who was desperate to keep the peace and buy back her family's love. I had to swallow my pride, my disgust, and my burning anger to secure her confession. I thanked Richard, hung up the phone, and took one final deep breath. The chaotic family drama had instantly evaporated from my mind. This was no longer a toxic domestic dispute over boundaries or respect. It was a calculated financial crime, and I was stepping firmly into the role of the investigator. I looked at the approved notification still glowing brightly on my phone screen. They thought they had outsmarted me. They assumed I would just quietly absorb the massive debt to avoid a public family war. They had no idea they had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to tear their entire foundation to the ground. I picked up my phone again, my hands remarkably steady now, and prepared to set the bait. Sitting alone in my home office, with the door locked and the blinds pulled tight against the afternoon sun, I stared at my phone resting flat on the mahogany desk. My hands were entirely steady, but my heart was hammering a relentless, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Richard, my fraud attorney, had given me explicit instructions. I had to call the woman who had just stolen my identity, forged my digital signature, and attempted to saddle me with a massive $60,000 fraudulent debt. I had to speak to Susan, and I had to make her believe that I was completely broken. I had to swallow every ounce of my pride, my professional dignity, and my burning anger. For the next 10 minutes, I needed to become the exact victim she had always assumed I was. I needed to be the weak, compliant, guilt-ridden daughter-in-law who was desperate to buy back her family's affection. It was a dangerous psychological game of cat and mouse. I knew that if Susan sensed even a fraction of hesitation in my voice, or if she detected the slightest hint of suspicion, she would immediately cover her tracks. She would delete the online loan portal, destroy the digital evidence, and claim absolute ignorance. I had to play my part perfectly. I had to hand her a victory so sweet and convincing that she would drop her guard completely. I took a deep, measured breath, the kind I usually take before walking into a high-stakes corporate risk assessment meeting. I picked up my phone and dialed Susan's number. It rang twice. Each ring felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. Susan answered on the third ring. Chloe, her voice floated through the speaker, dripping with that familiar, patronizing warmth she reserved for people she felt superior to. To what do I owe this surprise? I closed my eyes and forced my breathing to become shallow and erratic. I pulled up the memory of Thanksgiving dinner, forcing myself to relive the burning humiliation of standing in front of 30 extended family members while she publicly executed my character. I used that genuine, raw pain to make my voice tremble. "Susan," I said, letting a soft, pathetic sob slip through my lips. "I am so sorry. I am just so incredibly sorry." The silence on the other end of the line was immediate and thick with smug satisfaction. I could practically see her standing in her immaculate kitchen, a triumphant smile spreading across her face. She thought her manipulation had finally broken my spirit. She thought the public shaming and the silent treatment had worked exactly as she planned. "Chloe, darling, whatever is the matter?" she asked, her tone shifting to fake maternal concern. "You sound absolutely terrible. I cannot take this anymore," I cried, leaning heavily into the performance. "The guilt is eating me alive, Susan. David and I have been arguing constantly, and the tension in our house is suffocating. You were completely right at Thanksgiving dinner. Family has to come first. I was being selfish and rigid, and I see that now. I cannot bear the thought of being the reason Travis loses his warehouse lease tomorrow morning." I paused, making sure she was hanging on to my every word. Then I dropped the bait directly into the trap. "I have my car keys in my hand right now," I continued, my voice rushing out in a breathless, frantic rush. "I am driving over to your house this very second. Please pull out the original business loan applications. I am ready to co-sign the commercial lease for Travis. I will sign everything today so the bank can process the funds by tomorrow." The reaction was instantaneous. The smugness vanished from the line, replaced by a deafening, terrified silence. I could hear the gears grinding in Susan's head as sheer panic set in. She was trapped in her own elaborate web of lies. She could not let me come over. She absolutely could not let me sit down and look at the original business loan documents because she knew a forged $60,000 personal loan was already processing under my stolen Social Security number. If I showed up to sign papers, the entire timeline would collapse and I would discover the massive federal crime she had just committed. "Oh no, sweetheart," Susan stammered. Her voice jumped an entire octave, entirely stripped of its smooth confidence. "You do not need to do that. Please do not drive over here, but I have to." I pushed back, playing the role of the desperate, anxious martyr. "The deadline is tomorrow morning. Travis needs that money for his logistics company, and I want to make things right. I am already putting my coat on." "Chloe, stop!" Susan commanded her words, rushing out in a frantic, sloppy mess. "You really do not need to worry about the paperwork anymore. Travis and we found another way to secure the funding. We did not want to stress you out any further after the holiday. Everything is completely fine." I refused to let her off the hook that easily. I needed the digital confession, and I needed it clearly stated. I forced another heavy sob into the phone. "But how do I know he is really okay?" I pleaded. "I am having a complete panic attack about this whole situation. I feel so guilty that I almost ruined his life. Please, Susan, I will not be able to sleep tonight unless I have absolute proof that the loan is handled and the business is saved. Can you just text me a confirmation that the money is secure? I just need the peace of mind in writing so I can stop spiraling." There was a brief, agonizing pause. Susan was weighing her options, desperate to keep me away from her house and away from the truth. "Of course, honey," she finally said, sounding incredibly eager to end the conversation. "I will text you right now. Just relax and stay home. Everything is taken care of." I ended the call and lowered the phone to my desk. The silence in my office was heavy and absolute. The fake tears dried on my cheeks, instantly replaced by a cold, razor-sharp clarity. I sat perfectly still, staring at the blank screen of my phone. Every second that ticked by felt like an hour. Would she actually send it? Or would her survival instinct kick in and stop her from putting a federal crime into a written text message? 2 minutes later, a sharp chime echoed through the quiet room. A new message notification flashed across the glass screen. I reached out my fingers, finally trembling, and tapped the icon. The message was from Susan. It read exactly as she had promised. "Don't worry about the paperwork, honey. Travis and I already took care of it on your behalf. The money is on its way." I stared at those glowing words. She thought she was comforting a broken, hysterical daughter-in-law. She thought she was cleverly covering her tracks to secure a stolen payout. She had no idea that she had just typed out a signed written confession to identity theft and wire fraud. I pressed the side buttons on my phone and took a screenshot. The screen flashed bright white for a fraction of a second, capturing the evidence forever. I immediately uploaded the image to a secure cloud folder and forwarded a copy directly to Richard's private email address. I leaned back in my leather desk chair and let out a long, slow breath. The dangerous game of cat and mouse was officially over. I was no longer the prey, and Susan was no longer the predator. The steel jaws of the trap had just snapped shut, and she was caught right in the middle of it. The trap was set, and the digital confession from Susan was safely secured in my cloud drive, but I knew I couldn't stop there. I needed to ensure that Travis never touched a single cent of that $60,000. The moment the funds were dispersed, the fraud would be infinitely harder to untangle, and my credit would be tied to his inevitably disastrous financial decisions. I pulled up my bank's internal directory, bypassing the standard customer service lines, and dialed the direct extension for the senior fraud investigator I often collaborated with on commercial accounts. His name was Greg, and he owed me a favor from a tricky corporate embezzlement case we had unraveled together last year. Greg answered on the first ring, his voice low and professional. I didn't waste time. I explained the entire situation, laying out the timeline of the forged personal loan, the stolen social security number, and the confession text I had just received. Greg listened intently, the silence on his end only broken by the rapid clicking of his keyboard as he pulled up the online lender's portal and cross-referenced it with my credit file. I see it, Chloe. Greg said, his tone shifting from professional to urgent. The loan is approved and the ACH transfer is pending. It's scheduled to hit the account tomorrow morning. I need you to intercept it, I told him, my voice steady, despite the adrenaline surging through me. I don't want the loan canceled yet. I need Travis to think the money has arrived. If they think the transaction failed, they'll panic and try another angle. I want them feeling victorious right up until the moment I drop the hammer. Greg understood immediately. We can divert the funds into a frozen holding account. he explained. Travis's portal will show a status of deposited, but if he tries to move the money, withdraw it, or initiate a wire transfer, it will trigger an immediate administrative block. The money will be untouchable. Do it, I instructed. And Greg, I need the IP logs for the loan application. I need to prove exactly where that forgery originated. It took Greg less than 20 minutes to work his magic. He forwarded me the technical data, and I stared at the screen as the pieces fell perfectly into place. The IP address used to submit the fraudulent application, the digital footprint of the crime traced directly back to the residential internet provider registered to Susan and Robert's home address. They hadn't even tried to hide it. They were so confident in their manipulation, so certain I would just absorb the debt to keep the peace, that they had committed federal wire fraud from their own living room couch. I printed the IP logs, sliding them into the heavy red folder, alongside Travis's civil lawsuit, the pre-foreclosure notice on my in-laws' estate, and the screenshot of Susan's text confession. The folder felt heavy in my hands, a physical manifestation of their deception and my impending retribution. That evening, the silence from my in-laws was deafening. There were no phone calls, no passive-aggressive text messages, demanding my signature, no guilt trips about Thanksgiving. They believed they had won. They thought they had outsmarted me, secured the money to pay off Travis's lawsuit, and saved their own sinking financial ship. I imagined them sitting in their sprawling, soon-to-be foreclosed home, celebrating their cleverness, completely oblivious to the fact that the money they thought they had stolen was locked away in a digital vault they could never access. The next morning, my phone buzzed with an incoming email. It was an extravagant, overly formal invitation from Susan, sent to the entire extended family, including David and me. The subject line read, "A celebration of Travis's new venture." The email detailed a lavish dinner reservation at an upscale steakhouse downtown for that Saturday evening, intended to celebrate Travis officially securing the funding for his boutique logistics firm. I stared at the invitation, a cold, calculated smile forming on my lips. Susan was doubling down on the lie, parading her fake victory in front of the same aunts and uncles who had judged me at Thanksgiving. She was inviting me to the very dinner where she planned to celebrate stealing my identity. It was a staggering display of arrogance, but it was also exactly what I needed. She was gathering the audience for me. She was setting the stage for her own public destruction. I forwarded the invitation to David, who had spent the last 2 days oscillating between shock and quiet fury as he processed the reality of what his family had done. I walked into the living room where he was sitting, the red folder tucked under my arm. Susan just invited us to a victory dinner. I told him, my voice calm and resolute. She thinks she got the money. She thinks she won. David looked up at me, the betrayal raw and painful in his eyes. "Are we going?" he asked, his voice tight with suppressed anger. I placed the red folder on the coffee table. "We are absolutely going," I said. "They wanted a public showdown at Thanksgiving, and I walked away. This time I'm bringing the receipts. They wanted to use my name as their backup plan. Now they are going to learn exactly what happens when you try to steal my life." 48 hours after I secured the digital confession, Susan made her next move. It arrived in my inbox as an extravagant digital invitation sent to our entire extended family. The subject line read, "A celebration of Travis and his new venture." I sat at my home office desk and stared at the screen, a cold and calculated clarity washing over me. Susan was not just content with stealing $60,000 using my stolen Social Security number. She needed to parade her supposed victory in front of the exact same aunts, uncles, and cousins who had publicly shamed me at her Thanksgiving table. She had booked a private dining room at one of the most exclusive downtown steakhouses. The arrogance was staggering. She was inviting me to a lavish dinner paid for by the illusion of her own wealth, just to rub my face in the fact that she had successfully bailed out her golden child. What she did not know was that the money was locked in a frozen fraud account, and she had already handed me the key to her federal indictment. I printed the invitation and brought it into the kitchen where David was sitting. The past few days had aged my husband. The realization that his own mother and brother had orchestrated a massive financial fraud, knowing it would completely destroy his wife, had shattered his entire worldview. He read the invitation resting on the granite counter, and I watched his jaw tighten. A week ago, David would have begged me to attend this dinner just to keep the peace and avoid a family feud. Today, he looked up at me with eyes full of absolute disgust for the people who had raised him. He asked me in a quiet, strained voice if we were actually going to attend this charade. I walked over, placed my hand firmly on his shoulder, and told him we were absolutely going. I reminded him that they had demanded a public showdown at Thanksgiving, and I had chosen to walk away to protect my peace. But tonight was different. Tonight we were walking straight into the lion's den, but this time I was the one bringing the teeth. David did not argue. He simply nodded, his loyalty now entirely and permanently shifted away from his toxic mother and completely to me. Saturday evening arrived with a heavy, suffocating humidity. Getting ready for this dinner felt entirely different from preparing for any other family gathering I had ever attended. I was not dressing to blend in or to play the familiar role of the quiet, accommodating daughter-in-law. I bypassed the soft floral dresses in my closet. Instead, I chose a tailored navy blue sheath dress and a sharp blazer. It was the exact outfit I wore when presenting high-risk commercial loan rejections to corporate banking boards. I pulled my hair back tight and simple. This was not just clothing. It was armor for a battle they did not even know they were fighting. David put on a dark suit, moving around our bedroom with a quiet, rigid determination. We did not speak much as we got ready. The air between us was thick with palpable tension. We were two people preparing to completely dismantle a toxic family structure that had survived on lies and manipulation for decades. The drive downtown was incredibly silent. When we pulled up to the valet stand at the steakhouse, the sheer financial absurdity of the situation hit me all over again. This restaurant charged $100 for a single steak. Susan and Robert were in active pre-foreclosure, 3 months behind on their mortgage with zero equity left to their names. Travis was facing a massive civil lawsuit and potential criminal charges for an uninsured traffic accident. Yet, here they were, hosting 30 people in a private dining room, continuing to perform their roles as wealthy, successful suburban elites. It was a terrifying display of financial delusion, and they were funding this fantasy with my stolen identity. The hostess greeted us with a polite smile and led us down a long, dimly lit hallway toward the private rooms. I could hear the muffled sounds of clinking crystal glasses and loud, booming laughter before we even reached the heavy oak double doors. It was Travis laughing, an arrogant and entirely unearned sound. David stopped for a fraction of a second, his hand hovering heavily over the brass door handle. He took one deep, stabilizing breath, looked at me to make sure I was ready, and pushed the doors open. The room inside was dripping with corporate opulence. Crystal chandeliers hung low over a massive, polished mahogany table. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated effortlessly with silver trays of expensive champagne and delicate appetizers. The same aunts, uncles, and cousins who had judged me so harshly at Thanksgiving were mingling and chatting, completely unaware that they were participating in a celebration of federal wire fraud. Holding court at the very head of the table was Susan. She wore a designer silk blouse, her hair perfectly styled, beaming radiantly as she accepted congratulations from an uncle I barely recognized. Travis stood right beside her, nursing a glass of expensive bourbon, acting every bit the successful entrepreneur who had just secured his future. When Susan saw David and me step through the doorway, her conversation stopped. Her smile widened into a mask of pure predatory triumph. She thought she had won. She thought I was walking into that room as a defeated, humiliated woman who had been successfully forced into submission. She raised her champagne glass slightly in my direction, her eyes locking onto mine across the crowded, noisy room. I held her gaze perfectly. I did not flinch, and I did not look away. I felt the heavy red folder resting securely inside my leather tote bag. The trap was fully set, the audience was gathered, and the curtain was about to rise on her absolute destruction. The private dining room at the Wellington Steakhouse smelled of aged leather roasted garlic and the suffocating weight of absolute delusion. It was one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city, the kind of place where the waitstaff wore crisp white jackets and the menus did not list any prices. As David and I walked through the heavy oak doors, the noise of the main dining room faded away, replaced by the clinking of crystal glasses and the booming, unearned laughter of my brother-in-law. Susan had spared absolutely no expense for her victory dinner. She sat at the very head of the massive mahogany table, wearing a brand new emerald green silk blouse, radiating the smug satisfaction of a woman who believed she had just outsmarted the entire world. Robert sat to her right, swirling a glass of expensive scotch, while Travis held court at the center of the table. The exact same aunts, uncles, and cousins who had glared at me with such intense judgment on Thanksgiving were now gathered around listening raptly as Travis spun wild fabricated tales about his boutique logistics firm. I walked into the room with my head held high and my posture perfectly straight. I wore a tailored charcoal suit, the exact outfit I reserve for terminating high-risk corporate accounts at the bank. My leather tote bag hung heavily from my shoulder, carrying the thick red folder containing the civil lawsuit, the pre-foreclosure notices, and the digital proof of their federal wire fraud. David walked beside me, his hand resting securely on the small of my back. A week ago, he would have entered this room walking on eggshells, desperate to appease his mother. Tonight, his jaw was rigidly set, and his eyes swept over his family with a cold, clinical disgust. When Susan spotted us, her eyes lit up with a predatory gleam. She thought we were walking into her domain as defeated, compliant victims. She assumed the overwhelming guilt of the holiday had finally broken me, and that I was arriving to bow my head and accept my place as the silent family funding source. "Chloe, David, you made it," Susan said. Her voice carried across the room, loud enough to ensure every single extended family member stopped talking and looked directly in our direction. She stood up and walked toward us, her arms outstretched for a theatrical hug that I smoothly sidestepped by pulling out my dining chair. She did not miss a single beat. She simply pivoted, placing a manicured hand on David's shoulder instead. "Please sit down. We are just about to order the wine." Susan gestured to the sommelier standing quietly in the corner. "We will take 3 bottles of the Reserve Cabernet, the vintage we discussed earlier." I sat perfectly still, doing the mental math. 3 bottles of Reserve Cabernet at a place like the Wellington would easily run close to $1,000. Susan and Robert were exactly 90 days delinquent on their mortgage. They had drained every ounce of equity from their massive suburban estate, and they were currently in active pre-foreclosure. Travis was facing a $60,000 settlement deadline by tomorrow morning to avoid criminal negligence charges for an uninsured traffic accident. Yet here they were performing the roles of wealthy, untouchable elites, funding their extravagant fantasy with the money they believed they had successfully stolen using my social security number. The sheer scale of their financial insanity was almost difficult to comprehend. The wine was poured, and the delicate appetizers arrived on silver platters. Travis was completely in his element. He leaned back in his leather chair, swirling his red wine, loudly explaining the logistical complexities of warehouse management to an uncle who was nodding along with deep respect. It was a masterclass in manipulation. Travis used corporate buzzwords he had clearly skimmed from a business article that afternoon, talking about supply chain disruption and scalable fleet metrics. He gestured expansively with his hands, describing fake vendor negotiations and imaginary profit margins. The aunts and uncles hung on his every word, completely oblivious to the fact that they were listening to a man whose only real logistical skill was dodging process servers. About halfway through the first course, Susan tapped her manicured fingernail against her crystal wine glass. The sharp, clear chime instantly silenced the room, mirroring the exact same tactic she had used to humiliate me at Thanksgiving. My heart rate stayed perfectly steady. I knew exactly what was coming. "I want to take a moment to welcome everyone." Susan began, her voice dripping with artificial grace. "We are here to celebrate Travis and the incredible launch of his new company. But more importantly, we are here to celebrate family." She looked directly at me down the length of the long table. Her eyes were bright with a triumphant, condescending pity. She was playing the role of the generous matriarch, extending mercy to the difficult and stubborn daughter-in-law. Chloe Susan said, her voice softening into a tone of fake maternal concern. "I want to publicly say that we are so glad you and David decided to join us tonight. I know that Thanksgiving was incredibly tense. Misunderstandings happen, especially when people are stressed about their careers and their personal finances, but family always moves past these things. We know you were just overwhelmed, and we want you to know that we forgive you." A gentle, approving murmur rippled through the aunts and uncles. They looked at Susan with absolute admiration. What a gracious woman they were silently communicating. What a big heart she has to forgive this selfish girl who initially tried to ruin her son's dreams. "We are just so relieved that everything finally worked out." Susan continued, raising her wine glass high. "Travis found his funding, the business is secure, and we can all move forward together with a clean slate. So here's to fresh starts and to always remembering that family takes care of its own." "Hear, hear," Robert echoed, raising his heavy glass of scotch. The entire table raised their glasses in unison. I picked up my crystal goblet of sparkling water, holding it steadily at chest level. I did not take a sip. I looked directly into Susan's eyes. I saw the absolute certainty in her gaze. She fully believed that the $60,000 had safely landed in an account controlled by Travis. She fully believed that her digital forgery was entirely untraceable. She fully believed that I would just quietly swallow the massive fraudulent debt, too terrified of causing a public scene to ever fight back. She had invited me here to witness my own financial execution, dressed up as a lavish celebration. She wanted me to eat a $100 steak while choking on the knowledge that I was paying for it with my ruined credit score. David reached under the heavy linen tablecloth and placed his hand firmly over mine. His grip was strong, grounding me in the reality of what we were about to do. He looked at his mother, his brother, and the extended family members who had so easily turned against his wife. The illusion of the tight-knit, loving family he had grown up believing in had completely evaporated. He gave my hand one single, decisive squeeze. It was the signal. The appetizers were cleared. The main courses were about to arrive. Susan had delivered her fake apology and accepted the blind praise of her captive audience. The setup was absolutely flawless. I let the silence stretch for just a few seconds longer, waiting for the exact moment when their confidence reached its absolute peak. I reached down into my leather tote bag, and my fingers found the smooth, cool cardboard of the thick red folder. Robert tapped his heavy crystal scotch glass with a silver butter knife. The sharp ringing sound cut through the low hum of conversation and the clattering of expensive silverware. The entire private dining room fell quiet as 30 faces turned toward the head of the table. Robert stood up slowly, adjusting the lapels of his tailored suit jacket. He smiled a broad, confident smile that reached all the way to the back of the room. I watched him raise his glass, his chest puffed out with the artificial pride of a man who believed he had successfully manipulated his way out of total ruin. "I want to propose a toast." Robert began, his voice booming with forced joviality, "to family and to the future. We all know Travis has had a few false starts over the years. Some people might have given up on him, but in this family, we do not give up. We pull together. And because we pulled together, Travis is officially launching his boutique logistics firm tomorrow morning." He looked down fondly at his oldest son. "We are so incredibly proud of the businessman you are becoming, Travis. To your bright and prosperous future." "Hear, hear," echoed around the table. Crystal glasses clinked together in a chorus of blind celebration. Travis grinned and took a long, arrogant sip of his red wine. Susan sat beside him, wiping a fake tear of joy from her cheek. She looked across the polished mahogany table and gave me a tight, victorious little smile. She fully expected me to sit there in silent humiliation, forced to swallow my pride, while they celebrated stealing $60,000 in my name. I did not raise my glass. I did not smile back. I reached down into my structured leather tote bag resting by my feet. My fingers brushed against the smooth, cool surface of the heavy red folders I had prepared earlier that afternoon. I had made exactly 10 copies. enough for every single aunt, uncle, and older cousin seated at the table to see the undeniable truth with their own eyes. I pulled the stack of red folders onto my lap. David was sitting right beside me. I felt his hand brush against my knee, a silent and steady anchor. I stood up. The scraping of my chair against the hardwood floor was loud enough to make several people turn their heads. "Actually, Robert," I said, my voice entirely calm and perfectly level, "I think we need to make a slight correction to that toast before anyone takes another drink." The smiles around the table began to falter. Susan stiffened her posture, going completely rigid. Robert let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, clearly prepared to play the role of the patient father dealing with a hysterical daughter-in-law. "Chloe, please," he said in a patronizing tone. "Tonight is about celebrating. Let us not ruin the evening with unnecessary negativity." "I am not ruining the evening, Robert," I replied, holding his gaze. "I am simply providing the investors with the proper financial disclosures." I placed the first red folder on the table and slid it firmly toward Aunt Carol, who was sitting to my left. I handed the next one to Uncle Richard across from her. I continued passing the folders down both sides of the long table, moving with the methodical precision of a banker distributing risk assessment reports. Confusion rippled through the room. The extended family exchanged bewildered looks as they opened the covers and stared at the dense legal documents inside. "What is this?" Travis demanded, his voice suddenly tight with panic. He tried to reach across the table to grab a folder from his cousin, but David stood up and physically blocked his path. "That is your boutique logistics firm, Travis," I announced to the entire room. I pointed to the first document inside the folder. "I want everyone to look at page 1. You will see a certified civil court docket from the state of Pennsylvania. 8 months ago, Travis caused a severe traffic accident. He totaled a luxury vehicle and caused significant bodily injury to the other driver. The most important detail is that Travis was driving completely uninsured." A collective gasp echoed through the private dining room. Aunt Carol covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes darting from the court papers to Travis. "The plaintiff offered an out-of-court settlement." I continued, my voice slicing through the heavy silence. "They demanded a lump sum payment of exactly $60,000 by tomorrow morning. If the payment is not made, Travis will face immediate bankruptcy, and the insurance company will refer the case to the district attorney for criminal negligence charges. There is no logistics company. There is no warehouse lease. There are no delivery vans. The entire business plan was an elaborate lie constructed to trick me into funding his legal bailout." Travis sank back into his chair, his face draining of all color. He looked like a cornered animal. "This is a complete fabrication," Susan shouted, jumping to her feet. Her voice was shrill and desperate, echoing loudly against the walls. "She is lying to you. She is trying to destroy this family because she is selfish and bitter. Do not look at those papers." I turned my attention directly to my mother-in-law. "Oh, Susan, I am just getting started." I gestured toward the second document in the folders. "I invite the family to look at page 12. You will find the county property tax records and the mortgage filings for Robert and Susan's immaculate suburban estate." Robert slumped down his shoulders, completely collapsing. The wealthy patriarch illusion shattered instantly. You see, I told the silent, captivated audience, Susan and Robert could not simply write a check to save their son from prison because they are entirely bankrupt. Over the last 10 years, they have secretly taken out multiple home equity lines of credit to fund their country club lifestyle and pay off previous debts for Travis. They have zero equity left. Furthermore, the document you are looking at is an active pre-foreclosure notice. They are exactly 90 days delinquent on their primary mortgage. The bank is actively repossessing the very home they invited you all to for Thanksgiving dinner. Uncle Richard let out a low whistle of absolute disbelief. He stared at his brother with an expression of pure disgust. The whispered conversations around the table stopped, completely replaced by a suffocating and heavy tension. The family was looking at Susan and Robert, not as successful elites, but as complete frauds. But the final document. I said, my voice dropping to a colder, sharper register, is the most important one. It is the reason we are all sitting in this incredibly expensive restaurant right now. I looked directly into Susan's eyes, refusing to let her look away. When I refused to co-sign the fraudulent commercial loan last week, Susan decided to take matters into her own hands. I instructed the family to turn to the final page in the red folder. You are looking at a formal report from my bank's fraud investigation department. 3 days ago, Susan and Travis stole my social security number from an old tax return. They submitted an application for a $60,000 unsecured personal loan using my identity, and they forged my digital signature. The air was entirely sucked out of the room. The toxic family drama had just graduated to a major federal crime, and every single person at the table knew it. I watched the last remaining drops of blood vanish from Susan's face. Her pristine silk blouse suddenly looked completely absurd against her ghost-white skin. She opened her mouth to speak, to scream, to deny it all, but her vocal cords simply failed her. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. The $60,000 was approved. I informed them, delivering the final, devastating blow. Susan invited you all here tonight to celebrate successfully stealing my identity to pay off her son's impending lawsuit. She brought you here to celebrate a felony. I stood tall in the center of the silent room, my shoulders pulled back, breathing in the crisp air of absolute vindication. The entire extended family sat frozen in a state of profound and unshakable shock, staring at the undeniable physical proof of the financial house of cards that had just violently collapsed right on top of the people who built it. The silence in the private dining room was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. 30 extended family members stared at the red folders resting on the pristine linen tablecloth. The illusion of my wealthy, perfect in-laws had shattered into jagged pieces, replaced by the cold proof of their impending bankruptcy and federal crimes. But Travis was not the kind of man who accepted defeat with grace. He was a cornered animal, desperate, exposed, and terrified. His face flushed a dark, violent crimson. He let out a guttural sound of pure rage and lunged across the mahogany table. His hands clawed toward the red folders, knocking over crystal wine glasses and sending expensive silverware clattering to the floor. He wanted to rip the documents to shreds, as if tearing paper could somehow erase the reality of his civil lawsuit and forged loan application. He never even touched them. David moved faster than I had ever seen him move before. My husband stepped squarely between his brother and the table, shoving Travis backward with a sudden force that rattled the room. Travis stumbled, crashing into an empty leather chair. He looked up at David, his eyes wide with shock. For 33 years, David had played the role of the peacemaker. He had been the compliant middleman who always absorbed all their toxic behavior to avoid a public scene. Not tonight. Tonight, David stood tall, forming a physical wall between his toxic family and his wife. "Do not take another step toward her," David commanded. His voice was a low rumble that echoed off the paneled walls. His tone carried no hesitation. Travis scrambled to his feet, breathing heavily. "David, you have to listen to us. Chloe is twisting the facts. She is trying to ruin my life." "You ruined your own life." "Travis," David shot back. "You drove without insurance. You caused that accident. Instead, you and our mother decided to commit a federal crime and steal my identity. You tried to destroy the woman I love to save yourself." Susan rushed forward, tears of panic breaking through her constructed facade. "David, sweetheart, please. You have to understand. We were desperate. We were just trying to protect your brother. We are your family." David looked at his mother, the woman who had manipulated him for his entire life. The disgust in his eyes was unwavering. "You are not my family," David said coldly. "Family does not forge signatures or steal social security numbers to save themselves. Family does not publicly humiliate a woman at Thanksgiving just to cover up a felony crime. You stopped being my family when you decided Chloe was an acceptable sacrifice. I am completely, permanently done with you. Both of you. Do not ever call my phone. Do not ever come to my house. You are dead to me." A collective gasp rippled through the stunned aunts and uncles seated around the table. Susan crumpled into her chair, burying her face in her hands, letting out theatrical sobs that generated absolutely zero sympathy. But the execution was not quite over. I had one final devastating truth to deliver. I walked around the table, stopping just a few feet away from Susan. I needed her to look up and see the face of the woman she had so severely underestimated for years. "Susan," I said softly. She looked up, her expression twisted with absolute terror. "You thought you were so clever," I told her, keeping my voice professional. "You thought you could secure that $60,000 loan behind my back. You thought you had won when the lender approved the application yesterday afternoon." Travis wiped his sweating forehead. "The money is already in my account," he sneered. "I saw the deposit notification. You can make all the dramatic speeches you want, Chloe. The loan processed. I have the cash to pay the settlement tomorrow morning. I am walking away clean." I smiled a cold, razor-sharp smile that made Travis step backward. "You really think a senior commercial loan underwriter would just let a fraudulent transaction process without interference?" I pulled a formal confirmation letter from my tote bag. It was from the Internal Fraud Investigation Division of the online lending institution. "That money never hit your account, Travis," I informed him. "I intercepted the transfer 24 hours ago. The funds were instantly diverted into a frozen administrative holding account. Your portal might say deposited, but you cannot touch a single penny. If you attempt to withdraw those funds tomorrow morning, the bank will immediately lock you out of the system." The last drop of blood vanished from his face. The financial life raft he had stolen was nothing more than an illusion. His impending bankruptcy and criminal negligence charges were now an absolute certainty, and Susan, I continued, shifting my gaze back to the woman who orchestrated this nightmare. "You should not have sent me that text message on Thursday night, proudly admitting that you and Travis took care of the loan on my behalf." Susan stopped crying. Her eyes widened in paralyzing horror as she finally realized the monumental, devastating mistake she had made. She had willingly handed me a signed written confession. My lawyer did not just freeze the funds, I told her, my voice carrying the cold, absolute finality of a judge. He tracked the digital footprint of the loan application perfectly. We have the IP logs proving the forgery originated from the internet router inside your house. My legal counsel forwarded those logs, the forged documents, and your text message confession directly to the local prosecutor for immediate criminal prosecution. The silence that followed was deafening. No one moved or spoke. "We are certainly not just talking about a family disagreement anymore, Susan," I said quietly in the frozen room. "You committed identity theft and federal wire fraud. The federal authorities already have all the evidence and they know exactly where you live." The heavy iron hammer had finally fallen for good. The silence in the private dining room was no longer just quiet. It was a suffocating vacuum that had swallowed all the air, all the forced laughter, and all the arrogant pride that had filled the space just moments before. 30 members of the extended family sat paralyzed in their leather chairs. They stared at the red folders scattered across the mahogany table like they were venomous snakes. The illusion of the perfect wealthy family had not just cracked. It had been completely pulverized into dust. I stood at the center of the room with my posture straight, feeling a profound and absolute sense of peace. For years, I had shrunk myself to fit into their world. I had swallowed their passive-aggressive insults, their condescending smiles, and their endless demands. But right now, standing in the wreckage of their lies, I had never felt taller. Aunt Carol was the first one to break the spell. She dropped her copy of the fraud report onto her untouched plate of filet mignon. She looked up at Susan, and the expression on her face was one of absolute, unadulterated revulsion. Aunt Carol was the same woman who had shaken her head at me during Thanksgiving, silently judging me for being a selfish daughter-in-law. Now that judgment had found its rightful target. "You forged her signature," Aunt Carol said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in that silent room it sounded like a gunshot. "You stole her social security number to take out a fraudulent loan while you are losing your own house to the bank. You invited us all here to celebrate a felony." Uncle Richard stood up from his chair. His face was flushed with anger. He looked at Robert, his own brother, with a mixture of pity and intense disgust. "Robert," he said, his voice completely devoid of the familial warmth they had shared just an hour ago, "you stood at the head of this table and gave a toast to your son's success. You drank expensive champagne and looked us all in the eye while knowing your house is in active foreclosure. You tried to destroy David's wife to cover up Travis and his criminal negligence. What kind of a man does that? Robert had no answer. The patriarch of the family, the man who loved to hold court and brag about his healthy retirement accounts, physically shrank into his chair. He stared at the crystal Scotch glass in front of him, unable to meet his brother's eyes. The wealthy, untouchable facade was entirely shattered. They were no longer the successful suburban elites they had pretended to be. They were broke, desperate criminals, and every single person in their social circle now knew the absolute truth. Travis tried to say something. He opened his mouth, stammering about misunderstandings and legal loopholes. But nobody was listening to him anymore. The golden child had lost his audience. The aunts, uncles, and cousins who had clapped for him a few minutes prior were now gathering their coats and their purses. They were pushing their chairs back, desperate to distance themselves from the toxic fallout. And then, Susan finally broke. The reality of the situation crashed down on her all at once. The bank was taking her massive estate. Her oldest son was going to face criminal charges and bankruptcy. Her extended family was looking at her like she was a monster. And the $60,000 she thought she had successfully stolen was locked away in a frozen fraud account. The pristine country club matriarch completely collapsed. She began to hyperventilate. Her breaths came in short, ragged gasps. Her perfectly styled hair fell into her face as she clutched the edge of the mahogany table for support. The sheer panic in her eyes was raw and undeniable. She realized that her manipulation tactics, her fake tears, and her carefully constructed guilt trips were completely useless against federal wire fraud charges. She had played her final card, and she had lost everything. She scrambled out of her chair and stumbled toward my husband. She completely abandoned her pride, reaching out to grab David's arm with trembling hands. "David," she gasped, tears streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. "David, please, you have to stop her. You have to tell Chloe to call off the lawyers. They are going to arrest us. They are going to send Travis to jail. We will lose the house. You cannot let them do this to us. We are your family. You have to help your family." David looked down at his mother's hands gripping his suit jacket. He did not flinch. He did not look conflicted. The man who had spent 33 years trying to keep the peace and appease his demanding parents was gone. He gently but firmly reached down and pried Susan's fingers off his arm. He took a deliberate step backward, creating a physical boundary that would never be crossed again. "You stopped being my family the second you decided to steal my wife's identity," David said. His voice was incredibly calm, carrying the cold weight of absolute finality. "You did not care if Chloe went to jail for a defaulted commercial loan. You did not care if the bank took our home to pay for your debts. You orchestrated a public execution to destroy her reputation at Thanksgiving. You made your choices. Now you get to live with the consequences." Susan let out a loud, theatrical sob, sinking to her knees right there on the expensive carpet of the private dining room. She wailed, begging for mercy, pleading for another chance to make things right. But her tears generated absolutely zero sympathy. No one moved to comfort her. No one offered a supportive shoulder. The extended family simply watched her breakdown with cold detachment, entirely repulsed by the woman they had once respected. I looked down at Susan crying on the floor. I felt no anger anymore. The burning rage that had fueled my investigation over the past 2 weeks had completely evaporated. It was replaced by a profound, unshakable indifference. She was no longer a threat to my marriage or my financial stability. She was just a desperate, broken woman facing the ruin she had built with her own 2 hands. I turned to David and nodded. "It is time to go," I said softly. David nodded back. He offered me his arm, and I took it. We did not say another word to Susan, Robert, or Travis. We did not need to. The red folders on the table had said everything that needed to be said. We turned our backs on them and walked toward the heavy oak doors of the private dining room. As we reached the exit, I paused and looked back over my shoulder one last time. The luxurious room was a scene of absolute devastation. The extended family was filing out in silence, refusing to even look at my in-laws. Travis was sitting with his head in his hands. Robert was staring blankly at the wall, and Susan was still weeping on the floor, surrounded by half-empty bottles of $1,000 champagne and plates of untouched filet mignon. I pushed the doors open, and we walked out into the dimly lit hallway of the steakhouse. The muffled sounds of Susan's sobs faded away as the heavy wooden doors clicked shut behind us. We left them sitting there in the wreckage of their own making. They were left to face the incoming police investigation, the impending foreclosure of their home, the absolute destruction of their social reputation, and a massive, exorbitant restaurant bill they had absolutely no way of paying. I stepped out into the cool night air with my husband, breathed in deeply, and walked away completely free. It has been exactly 6 months since that Thanksgiving dinner. 6 months since I dropped those red folders on the mahogany table at the Wellington Steakhouse and watched my in-laws' entire universe collapse. In the movies, the bad guys usually go to jail in a dramatic montage, while the hero walks away into the sunset. In reality, the legal system moves incredibly slowly, but when it finally grinds forward, it is absolutely relentless. Travis was formally indicted on 2 federal charges: wire fraud and identity theft. He tried to hire a defense attorney, but when the lawyer saw the digital IP logs and the screenshot of Susan's confession text, he immediately advised Travis to take a plea deal. There was no defense. He had committed the crime from his own living room router, and his mother had put the confession in writing. He is currently awaiting sentencing, facing a minimum of 3 to 5 years in federal prison. The $60,000 civil lawsuit from his uninsured car accident did not disappear either. Without the fraudulent loan money to settle the claim, the insurance company took him to trial. They won a massive judgment against him, forcing him into immediate and absolute bankruptcy. His wages will be garnished for the rest of his foreseeable adult life. There will be no boutique logistics firm. There will be no country club memberships. His financial future is completely and utterly destroyed. As for Susan and Robert, the fallout was equally devastating. The bank did not care about their social standing or their carefully curated suburban reputation. They were 90 days delinquent on their primary mortgage and had completely exhausted every single line of credit attached to their $900,000 estate. The active pre-foreclosure became a formal foreclosure. 2 months ago, the bank officially repossessed the property. I heard through David's cousins that they were forced to pack up their luxury furniture and designer clothes and move into a tiny, cramped 2-bedroom rental apartment on the far industrial edge of town. They have been completely cut off by the rest of the extended family. The aunts and uncles who had once praised Susan as the gracious matriarch now refuse to even return her phone calls. The humiliation of being exposed as fraudulent, bankrupt criminals was the one thing their social circle could never forgive. David and I did not stick around to watch the final pieces fall. We did not want front row seats to their misery. 3 months ago, David accepted a transfer with his company, and we relocated to a new state entirely. We bought a beautiful, modest house with a large backyard and a quiet neighborhood where no one knows about the toxic family we left behind. We protected our peace, and more importantly, we protected our credit. The distance has been incredibly healing for David. He spent 33 years twisting himself into knots, trying to appease a mother who saw him as an afterthought and a brother who saw him as an ATM. It took watching them try to destroy his wife for him to finally wake up. He is in therapy now, unpacking decades of manipulation and gaslighting. It is not an easy process, but he is doing the work. I is finally learning how to set boundaries and how to value himself outside of his family's demands. I think about that Thanksgiving dinner sometimes. I think about how close I came to caving under the pressure. I think about David begging me to just sign the papers to keep the peace. If I had signed that loan, if I had let Susan bully me into becoming their financial meat shield, my pristine credit score would be ruined right now. My wages would be garnished to pay for Travis's crimes, and our new house would be nothing but a dream. I saved my own life by refusing to be their backup plan. Sitting in the quiet warmth of my new living room, 1,000 miles away from that disastrous Thanksgiving dinner, I finally understand what true peace actually feels like. For so many years, I genuinely believed that the heavy, suffocating tension I felt whenever my phone rang was just a normal part of being a supportive wife. I had convinced myself that absorbing the constant financial shocks and the endless emotional demands of my husband's toxic relatives was simply the price of admission for a successful marriage. I thought that shrinking myself and ignoring my own professional instincts would somehow buy their love and respect, but peace built on your own silent suffering is not peace at all. It is just a hostage situation wrapped up in a holiday greeting card. Looking back at the absolute wreckage of my in-laws' shattered country club illusion, I do not feel a single ounce of guilt. I feel a profound and unshakable sense of freedom. So many of us are conditioned from a very young age to be the designated peacemakers in our families. We are explicitly taught to smooth over the rough edges of bad behavior, to swallow our legitimate concerns, and to put the needs of the collective far ahead of our own survival. When Susan and Travis dropped that completely fraudulent business plan onto my kitchen island, they were heavily relying on that exact social conditioning. They gambled my entire financial stability on the arrogant assumption that I would be too terrified of causing a public scene to actually stand my ground. They weaponized the word family to mask an aggressive, calculated financial crime. But I have learned the hardest way possible that family is a title earned through mutual respect and consistent care. It is absolutely not a free license to exploit, manipulate, and steal from the people you are supposed to protect. Family is not simply a matter of shared blood or a marriage certificate. Family consists of the people who show up for you with honesty and who respect your boundaries. I want you to think about the financial red flags you might be ignoring in your own life right now, just to keep a false sense of peace. Financial abuse within families is rarely talked about openly because it constantly hides behind the noble shield of helping out loved ones. It cleverly disguises itself as temporary loans, sudden emergencies, or guilt trips about loyalty. But you must never ignore those glaring warning signs to maintain a comfortable lie. When your instincts scream that a situation is a toxic trap, you have to listen to that inner voice. Setting ironclad financial boundaries is not an act of cruelty or selfishness. It is a necessary act of basic self-preservation. Setting boundaries is not a betrayal, and it is certainly not an abandonment of your loved ones. It is simply the healthy recognition that you cannot pour from an empty cup, and that people who truly love you will never ask you to destroy your own future for their temporary comfort. I spent countless sleepless nights agonizing over my initial refusal to co-sign that $60,000 loan. I worried endlessly about the malicious whispers, the harsh judgment, and the brutal public shaming that I ultimately endured at that dining room table. But the alternative was letting them drag me down into their dark, bankrupt reality. I realized that you cannot save people who are entirely committed to their own destruction. You cannot reason with people who view your hard-earned stability as their personal emergency fund. Giving yourself permission to stop seeking approval from people who will never genuinely give it to you is one of the most liberating experiences you can ever have. If you have ever been heavily pressured to set yourself on fire simply to keep your toxic family members warm, I need you to hear these words and hold them close to your heart. Walking away is not a betrayal. It is vital self-preservation. Your financial future, your pristine credit score, and your daily mental health are worth infinitely more than any twisted sense of family obligation. You do not owe your livelihood to people who view you as nothing more than a convenient human shield. Stand your ground firmly. Protect your name, your assets, and your peace of mind at all costs. Never let anyone turn you into their backup plan. You have the absolute right to build your own life and protect the safety of your own home. You get to decide who has access to your life and on what exact terms they are allowed to stay. Thank you so much for staying with me through this entire journey. Sharing this has been incredibly difficult, but I know there is someone out there right now who desperately needs to hear that they are not alone in this fight. If my story resonated with you or gave you the courage to finally stand up for your own boundaries, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need them the most. I also love building a real community with all of you. Please drop a comment below and let me know exactly what city or state you are watching from and what time it is there right now. I read every single comment, and it brings me so much joy to see where our connections reach. Remember that you define your own worth, and you always have the power to walk away from the table when respect is no longer being served. Take wonderful care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next story.